A young boy, a budding writer and artist, is visited by the spirit of his beloved cat, who spins tales about the magical kingdom of cats. But increasingly, as he is targeted for bullying, he and his family discover that the kingdom might be more than just his active imagination. Okay, the setup is, in Pussy Boy, 9-year-old Davy Myers has lost his faithful friend Flora, but she promises to return. When he finds Grey Cloud, a new stray kitten, he hides in the closet with her, transcribing Flora's stories of the magical kingdom, where cats protect the secret of the universe. As bullies taunt and threaten Davy, he gains strength from his journal, which may also become the instrument of his undoing. Throughout the novel, there are pages from Davy's journal and also Flora's entries in the journal, which is a bit unusual. They're interspersed throughout the narrative. Right before this chapter, the one I'm about to read, Davy shares his essay on the land of the kingdom of cats. He's in 4th grade. It doesn't go over well. He's met with laughter, derision, and is nicknamed Pussy Boy. Okay, I want to say something about the title. I know it's controversial, but since we have a certain president in office, I think the Pussy Boy is out of the bag and we're claiming it again as our own. So we're going to call it Pussy Boy. That's social justice. The teacher, Mrs. Hoover, is more alarmed about this story. So his mother is brought in for a meeting. The setting of this is a small steel town in western Pennsylvania. The year is 1968. The chapter is called Grown Up Words. Mrs. Hoover's office was just behind her desk, and Davy could see his mother's gold coat refracted in the dimpled window. Through the door, he could make out talking, and if he listened real hard, he'd hear words. Many of them he didn't understand. He perked up when the doorknob twitched, but the door only pulled shut from the inside. Inside, Mrs. Hoover stood in the doorway, making sure she had Mrs. Myers' attention. "Blasphemed, Mrs. Hoover?" Mother was saying. "You really think a 9-year-old is capable of blasphemy?" "Did you read this section here? I circled it in red." She moved around to her side of the desk, leaning over the paper like a turkey vulture, eyeing roadkill. Mother read the offending paragraph out loud. "People would guess that it is God they are trying to find, but cats know there is no God." She looked up at the gray-haired teacher, who now appeared to be shaking. "If I'm not mistaken, he's talking about the kingdom of cats, not the planet Earth." "Still, Mrs. Myers," Mrs. Hoover said with some amount of moral indignation, "this is a Christian nation, and to suggest otherwise, whether fantasy or not, is blasphemy in my book. No God, nonsense, but dangerous nonsense. Last time I checked, this was a secular school district." Mother was trying her best to remain calm. As she watched the teacher shudder and tremble, she actually felt sorry for her. And of course, this wasn't the first of her children to elicit this type of behavior. Stephen was an expert at pushing buttons, and as she recalled, he'd instigated a very similar meeting in this very same room. But Davy didn't ruffle feathers intentionally. It was never his way. He was just so adamant. That was it. He adamantly held on to his beliefs. And in this case, he probably had no idea what he'd wandered into. "I don't know what type of progressive household you run, Mrs. Myers," Mrs. Hoover said, her hands tightly gripping the offensive paper, "but I expect decency and moral rectitude from my students. I expect they show proper respect for all." "I think you're reading a lot into a little bit of fantasy, Mrs. Hoover." "Be that as it may, I think you should watch him carefully. Morality is learned at youth. As is intellectual curiosity, Mother had had it. And unless you have something vitally important to say about my son's behavior, I think we can go." Mrs. Hoover was not done with this point. "Oh, no. Well, he's failed the assignment. He was asked to write a description of a place," which he did, Mother interjected, "a description of a place that could possibly exist. Not some fantasy land where doors lead to nowhere and the moon shines all day. It doesn't make any sense." Now Mother put on her calm voice. It was the voice she used when she had to convince recalcitrant children to behave. "Mrs. Hoover, I believe he did indeed complete the assignment as you requested. You didn't stipulate that it had to be a real place, did you? I told them it could be made up, but one expects some semblance of reason or reality. Mother picked up her handbag. Then you have a lot to learn about children, Mrs. Hoover. Mrs. Hoover stood up, her voice cracked with frustration. I will fail your son. Mother wanted to laugh at this silly woman, but knew that Davy could most likely hear what was being said. He was just outside the door. She said quietly, why don't I have Davy repeat the assignment? Something more to your specifications. Someplace real. Would you accept that? Mrs. Hoover tucked her chin into her chest and looked out over her glasses. A reluctant, bitter smile cracked what remained of her cherries in the snow lipstick. I suppose, she began, I suppose if he turns in another paper tomorrow, I will consider it against his grade. Well, that's very fitting of you, Mrs. Hoover. Mother had her hand on the doorknob and was about to leave when Mrs. Hoover stopped her. It's not normal, you know, Mrs. Myers. A kingdom of cats. Now Mother could show nothing but pity. Oh, Mrs. Hoover, imagination is one of the most normal things in the world. It's unhealthy. A kingdom of cats that smells like springtime all year long, where the sun shines well into the night, where every cat has its own window to gaze out. It sounds lovely to me. And this last part, she added, just to tweak the daffy old woman, it sounds like heaven. And with that, she did swing the door open, walk over to the desk where Davy sat, and held out her hand. Come on, Davy, let's go home. Mrs. Hoover stood shaking in the office doorway. Davy grabbed his windbreaker and turned to his teacher. Goodbye, Mrs. Hoover. Mother took his hand and whisked him out of the room. She was walking a bit too fast for his little legs to keep up. Hold up, Davy begged, but they were now racing down the stairs. Some people, Mother fumed. What did she say? Davy asked as his mother swung open the school door. Just let me get you home, then we can talk. They walked in brisk silence across the field and home.